On the line with us is the founder and editor-in-chief of the National Memo, editor-at-large of Type Investigations, a nonprofit organization investigative reporting organization formerly known as the Investigative Fund, author of the brilliant new book with input from George Conway, The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. Joe Conason. Joe, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us. What provoked you to write this book?
Tom, it's great to be back with you again after a long time.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Let me say that the story of how I came to write this book is told in the introduction, which I've posted on nationalmemo.com so people can have a free look and see whether they think the book might be for them. This book came about because my wife, Elizabeth Wagley, read an article in The Baffler from 2012 by the historian Rick Perlstein, who I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. And Rick had written a very amusing piece for The Baffler about the Mitt Romney campaign and the sort of mendacities and misleading propaganda in that campaign against Barack Obama's reelection. But then the piece that Rick wrote kind of digressed into the fact that he had, in working on this story, he had subscribed to a number of conservative websites and publications and found himself inundated in his email with every kind of solicitation for a con or a scam that you could imagine. Overpriced gold, fake cancer cures, nutrition supplements that didn't work. I mean, just about everything under the sun that,
This happened to me, by the way. In 2015, I gave $15 to the Donald Trump campaign because I wanted to get on his mailing list. I do that with politicians often. And it took me years to get all of them into my spam list. But I've been swamped with everything you just described on top of, just
So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. So Elizabeth read this piece and she said, you need to read this. I think there's a book in this. And because, in fact, it's just an enormous phenomenon. And as Rick said in that kind of seminal article, it is inextricable from the rest of what passes for conservatism at this point. The scam is this at the center of right-wing ideology, right-wing propaganda, the whole right-wing business is now thoroughly intertwined with this. And to me, when I read this, I was like, yes, this is a good idea. And moreover, it seemed to me to encapsulate how Donald Trump had come to be the boss of the right. He so embodies the scam mentality and the urge to swindle people and these kind of skills of the con man that I knew if I went into this and wrote this book, it would explain a lot about how we got to where we are.
Well, and we'll start with the history in just a second, but this does go back a long way. I mean, I believe it was John Maynard Keynes who said that conservatism is engaged in one of the oldest frauds. I'm paraphrasing here, which is the search for a moral justification for selfishness.
Exactly.
So, here we are.
It's worse than selfishness. I mean, selfishness is bad enough in many forms, but this is actually, ripping people off.
Yeah,
I mean,
this goes beyond greed. This is
brazenly. Yes, brazenly. It's not just defending what's yours against any claim, but going much further than that and taking what belongs to other people under false pretenses, and that is really at the core of what is happening now.
Well, it's a brilliant book. We're talking with Joe Conason, his new book, The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. And you start the book with the era of Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn. Lay the field for us.
Well, Tom, as I'm sure you will understand, that was a bit of a conceit. Once I realized I was going to write this book and I started to put it together in my mind, it occurred to me that since I knew we were going to conclude with chapters about Trump and Trumpism and the people surrounding Trump, that one might start with Roy Cohn, his mentor, the lawyer whose name he cried out in the White House when he felt that he was in battle. Where is my Roy Cohn? But not just because of Trump. The fact, as I looked closely at Roy, who I covered back in the days when I was at the Village Voice, because he was actually kind of a crypto presence in New York politics back then when I was a young reporter, the more I realized that the acceptance of Roy Cohn, someone like him, who had absolutely no morality, a self-serving, crook, didn't pay his taxes, didn't pay people who worked for him, lied his way through court cases, ripped off his own clients to the point where he was eventually disbarred at the end of his life, that someone like that, the acceptance of him by the most prominent figures on the right, Ronald Reagan, William Safire of the New York Times, William Buckley, they all counted Roy as their friend, and they lionized him, they lifted him up, they celebrated him. And to me, that symbolized the beginning of a real moral degeneration in conservatism, which was, after all, supposed to be an ideology, a philosophy, you could even say, of civic virtue, of moral hygiene, of moral authority. And you can't have it both ways. You can't be the movement that says, oh, we love Roy Cohn and Roy Cohn is wonderful, and we all kind of rely on Roy Cohn to help us, despite his manifest moral flaws, and also claim to be, the philosophy of virtue. So,
what did the William F. Buckleys of the day think of the Roy Cohns and Richard Nixons of the day?
Well, Bill Buckley had the good sense to be embarrassed by them. He attacked you, as I know Tom, because
I used to read his stuff all the time in the late 50s and 60s.
I've read so much of your work about this stuff, and I know it inside and out. Bill Buckley had the sense to be embarrassed by the excesses. But in fact, he publicly celebrated Roy Cohn. They had a big dinner for Roy, with a black tie event. Bill Buckley was kind of the master of ceremonies. I mean, it goes on and on. And Safire, the late columnist for the New York Times, who did so much harm, same thing. He was, Roy helps me, I help him. He was interviewed at the time. There was a symbiotic relationship, and Roy was, in the shadows, extremely powerful and influential.
Was the moving from Roy Cohn into the kind of the Nixon era here, or maybe even the Goldwater era, was the deal struck basically of the GOP like, well, we realize, William F. Buckley saying, the modern conservative stands athwart the arc of history with his hand out shouting stop and all this kind of stuff. That's all well and good, but people are not enthusiastic about that. So we'll go along with the grifters and the con artists and later the religious grifters, the Jerry Falwells, in order to get the votes so that we can do what we think is noble, which is, serving the interests of the ruling class that we think without a ruling class society will eventually fall apart, which I would argue was basically Bill Buckley's worldview. Or was, as in purely symbiotic relationship, or was it something different? How did these grifters end up in control of the Republican Party, essentially? We got a minute or two here before we're going to have to hit a quick break. So,
well, I would say, Tom, that the way they end up in this position begins with the rise of a man named Richard Viguerie, who figured out how to basically vacuum in money from the grassroots.
Yeah, he was the mail order guy.
He was the direct mail guy who managed to monetize the Goldwater campaign, or the aftermath of the Goldwater campaign, into an enormous list that they had never had of millions of people who were willing to give money for these causes. And of course, the ability, as Viguerie discovered, to just get people to send you money by asking them for it quickly became, a scenario for enormous grifting.
Yeah,
that's the thumbnail explanation.
Yeah, no, I get it, and that leads us to people like Paul Weyrich and a whole bunch of them. We'll continue the conversation in just a second. We're talking with Joe Conason, the founder and editor-in-chief of National Memo. His new book, The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. So, Joe, as much as I am fascinated by that era of my youth, I mean, literally, the 50s, 60s, 70s, what I find fascinating is the rise of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and his ability to convince Americans that the horse and sparrow theory that Harding had used in 1920 and that McKinley had used in 1898, as I recall, or 1896, that if you feed the horses extra oats, the extra oats will pass through. They can't digest them, and so the sparrows will have more oats to pick out of the horse patties, in the streets. I mean, this all went back to the days when everybody had, towns had horses.
Yeah, they wouldn't describe it that way, but yes, that's exactly.
No, that's literally how they described it. It was called the horse and sparrow theory, and they actually.
I'm saying, but not Reagan.
No, Reagan didn't describe it. No, he reinvented it as a trickle-down thery. We would pour a whole bunch of wine into the top glass, and it'll spill into all the other little glasses, and et cetera. So it just amazed me how people just fell for that. What was at the core of the Reagan campaign in 1980, in your opinion? I mean, outside of Jimmy Carter being beat up because Reagan cut the deal with the Iranians to hold the hostages, what was the essence of his grift that got him into the White House?
Well, Reagan was a charming figure. He was a sunny, morning in America candidate who stood in contrast to the somewhat gloomy Jimmy Carter at that point. So it's one thing, and big promises. What you were alluding to is supply side economics. That if we only cut taxes for the wealthy, then the entire economy would boom, and we would also have to cut benefits to people. But that was kind of a footnote. And it was an enormous lie. I mean, I discussed this in the book in passages about a man named David Stockman, who was the head of the Office of Management and Budget, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, he's been on this program.
Under Reagan, a congressman from Michigan, who eventually unburdened himself of the truth to a great reporter named William Greider, who wrote about it for the Atlantic magazine, which was essentially that what had happened when Reagan's landmark legislation passed on budget and taxes was that the hogs were feeding at the trough. Lobbyists for the wealthy and corporations came and took everything, and the upshot was there was to be nothing left for the middle class and poor, to the point where they reclassified, as I know you recall, ketchup became a vegetable in school lunches because they just weren't going to spend anything on anybody except themselves. That was the essence of it. And along with that came a huge gang of grifters and crooks, some of whom are still with us today, like Roger Stone, like Paul Manafort, who was there at the time. And the Reagan administration was the biggest crime wave in government in our history up until the advent of Trump. This is, statistically proven. I go through all of the data in my book.
There you go.
Just to show, what had happened as a consequence of unprincipled people taking control of the conservative movement when Reagan rose to power.
There you go. The book is The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. We're talking to Joe Conason, the author of his newest book, The Longest Con: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism. Joe, we were just talking about how the Reagan administration was basically the biggest political crime wave that America had, arguably in its entire history. And although I think Andrew Jackson probably, but anyway,
well, there was Teapot Dome as well. I mean, you're the historian here.
Yeah. Well, Teapot Dome was that was tiny stuff. I mean, Albert Fell was the Secretary of the Interior, or the Secretary of the Navy, I think. And well, we don't need to get into that. But anyway,
it was notorious. But
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
it was a big crime wave under Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, didn't take any of it for himself, as far as I could tell, or at least nothing significant. But he was surrounded with crooks, starting with Attorney General Ed Meese.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we got George Herbert Walker Bush and his son George W. Bush, and I think the common thought in America is, yeah, Trump may be a grifter and Reagan might have been a hustler, but those guys were noble people. They were part of American nobility that stretches back through, Prescott Bush and Brown Brothers Harriman and blah 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 blah. Tell us about their administrations.
Well, George Herbert Walker Bush. Again, these Republican administrations attract a certain class of con man and criminal around them. In fact, so George W. Bush was really, in many ways, the precursor to Trump. I wrote a previous book about W called It Can't Happen Here, which was about the fact that, and I believe I was on this show to talk about it back when.
I have the book.
But that book sort of presaged the rise of an authoritarian element in the Republican Party, accompanied by, pseudo-religion. And in fact, when people talk now about how, well, Trump is being deified by the Republican Party, and they say that he's, chosen by God and so on and so forth, those same blasphemous themes were sounded when W was president. I'm sure you'll probably remember that. It was stunning, the claims that were made on his behalf and that he made about how it was providential that he had been raised up by the Lord to deal with Iraq, which didn't work out that well. And so now they all pretend that never happened, but it did. And some of the same figures, same swindlers on the evangelical right, who were with him are still around with Trump. Rod Parsley, who's a preacher in Ohio, who has a mega church and preaches what is called the prosperity gospel that I discuss at some length in this book, because they really are around Trump. Trump very much resembles a prosperity gospel preacher. And what they claim is the absolute authority of the minister, who is anointed as a prophet by God, and who can demand almost anything from the parishioners, especially their money, with the promise in exchange that they will receive wealth and good health and anything they want. And it's just the most arrant, ridiculous religious scam. But there are millions of people who give money to these people, Tom, and they in turn love Trump. They gathered around Trump in 2015, anointed him in Trump Tower as their candidate, and
grifters knew grifters, it seems.
Grifters.
Joe, we just have a minute left here. What is the biggest takeaway that you want people to know about, from this book, and what's the biggest learning that you had that you wanted to share with people?
What's important in this book, Tom? I mean, there are a number of things that I want people to get from it, but what I wish could happen is that people who read this book would share it with their conservative friends. The reason being that it would be great for the conservatives, true conservatives, I guess you could say, to realize that their movement is being ripped off by these people. It's why in this book I mostly quote conservatives about this, many of them who are upset about it, including some very hardline people like Eric Erickson of Red State and Jim Garrity of the National Review. And it's why I asked George Conway, who is a real honest conservative, to write the foreword to my book. He happens to be my friend, but although we were once at swords crossed back in the day, but now he's part of the Popular Front Against Fascism. And, he too would like to see a conservatism that was stripped of these crooks and grifters and scammers.
I think it would only benefit our country, frankly. We do need both sides, or two sides.
That's absolutely my point.
Joe Conason, the brilliant Joe Conason. The book is The Longest Con, How Grifters, Swindlers, and Frauds Hijacked American Conservatism, available wherever you find fine books. Joe, thanks so much for dropping by.
So grateful to you, Thom. Thank you.
Very nice, very wonderful having you with us. Thank you.